I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
Walter got Winston back to London in March 1932, unscathed despite the constant threat of assassination during his lecture tour of the United States. Winston was exhausted. He had been severely battered by being run down in New York, and virtually daily travel or lectures for more than 2 months had not been an ideal recuperation. It was also a time of sadness, for the two men must part again. As a private citizen, not a government minister, Winston could no longer expect official protection. This time it seemed that their paths would not cross again. But new and sinister forces were now stirring in Europe, and before the decade was out, Walter's help would again be needed.
A few days after our arrival at Chartwell, I took my leave of Winston. He referred to the way I'd dealt with problems after his accident and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you."
For Walter, it was back to Scotland Yard and the job which had so bored him for the previous 2 years.
For a year or two again I chased communists, a lot who seldom give you either a thrill or a fight. I hated this beyond description. I could never understand why anyone would want to be a communist. For one thing, they never took baths, and you could smell them in the dark.
Churchill's return home was to an equally unsatisfactory prospect. There was no likelihood of regaining office as a minister. He now concentrated on his writing, and in particular the biography of his great ancestor, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, for which he had taken the equivalent of a £500,000 advance in 1929. In August, he set off to tour the battlefields of John Duke, as he called Marlborough, following the course of his great march all the way from Flanders to Bavaria. The Germany in which much of this trip took place was a country in ferment. Mass unemployment and political extremism had been unleashed by the Depression. One man who had benefited from this was the nondescript but mesmeric Adolf Hitler. In barely 3 years, he had come from being a rabble-rouser to be the leader of a mass movement and the second largest party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. Hitler's combination of promising to make Germany great again and blaming many of the country's problems on the Jews had wide appeal. By early September, Churchill had reached Munich, where he was joined by Clementine, Sarah, and Randolph. It was then that a curiously prophetic incident took place, which Walter later mentioned in his journal. Randolph had a young German friend, Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl, who was Adolf Hitler's press secretary.
It was possible that he'd been instructed to get in touch with Winston by the Führer, because he suggested that they should meet. At this time, Hitler's aims had not come to full maturity, and Winston had no particular bias against him, except for his attitude to the Jews. Mr. Churchill spoke at length on the subject, and wanted to know why the Führer was so violent about the Jews. An appointment was made for them to meet. Apparently, the go-between had informed Hitler of Winston's remarks about the Jews, following which, Hitler decided not to keep the appointment. Over the course of years, invitations from Hitler were made to Winston, but owing to his knowledge of what was happening in Germany under the Führer, he found reasons not to attend. It is claimed that Hitler, realizing the potential power of Winston, said that he dreaded the day, if Germany and England became involved in a war, when Churchill came to any position of power. If such a thing occurred, he would bring the whole world against Germany.
Hanfstaengl, who had the sense to go to the United States in 1937 and not come back, later wrote that Hitler did not have the social guts to meet Churchill, putting his refusal down to his feelings of lower-class inferiority. Just after his near meeting with the man whose defeat would ensure his immortality, Winston had caught paratyphoid, and after 2 weeks being treated in a Swiss clinic, returned to England in a very shaken state. He took several months to shake off the illness. During this time, Hitler had been brought to power by an extraordinary series of miscalculations by his opponents, and quickly established a dictatorship. While his future enemy consolidated his power, Winston seemed content. The years from 1931 to 1935, apart from my anxiety on public affairs, were personally very pleasant to me. I lived mainly at Chartwell, where I had much to amuse me. I built, with my own hands, a large part of 2 cottages and extensive kitchen garden walls, and made all kinds of rockeries and waterworks and a large swimming pool. It was to be one of the few periods in Winston's life when he was not under threat and the target of people who wished to harm him. Winston's main anxiety on public affairs was his increasing concern about the growing threat to peace. By November 1934, he was warning of the threat that Nazi air power would pose to Britain. Hitler had not revealed his rearmament plans or the existence of his new Luftwaffe at that stage, but his intention to rebuild Germany's armed forces was an open secret. While Winston was finding a new political cause, Walter had managed to get a transfer back to the Personal Protection Branch. His first assignment after Winston was in many ways a very different man, although equally energetic: the socialist Jimmy Thompson, who had risen from train driver to Secretary of State for the Dominions.
He was the greatest cusser I ever heard, including the Americans, and in half a dozen other ways a most agreeable charge. He loved sports. He was a fine golfer and fisherman, an insatiable football fan. And he loved horse racing, gambling and card playing. His wife Maggie was a servant girl when he married her, and they rose together in English life noisily and happily.
He was sorry to leave Thompson suddenly, after he had been promoted to inspector and assigned to diplomatic protection. This promotion had been very much due to Winston's efforts.
During the lecture tour, he suddenly asked me why I had remained a sergeant for so many years. I told him that my promotion had been delayed because I'd been with him instead of doing normal police work.
Winston got to work on Lord Trenchard, the former head of the RAF, who was now Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and eventually Walter's promotion came through. Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative leader, became Prime Minister of the national government in 1935, but made no attempt to bring Winston back as a minister. Walter had no doubts as to why this was.
Winston went so far in 1935 as to point out what the strength of the German and British air forces would be in 1937, and that the former would probably be double ours in that year. Mr. Baldwin repudiated this information, but Winston's figures could not be ignored when the German Chancellor stated openly that the German Air Force in March 1935 had achieved parity with ours, and Mr. Baldwin had publicly to own up that he was wrong. The about-face made Baldwin more determined than ever to keep Winston out of the cabinet, and made the latter more angry at his exclusion.
Churchill now had the clear focus for which his wilderness years are best remembered, and his warnings about the need to confront the dictators, in particular Hitler, became increasingly urgent. Shortly after this, Walter completed 25 years' service in the police force and decided to retire.
The promotion, when it came, was too late. My home life was in tatters. I felt I had to get away.
He was awarded a pension of £6 13 shillings a week, and his record of service was marked Conduct Exemplary. The rest of the record is blank, because almost all the work he had undertaken was secret. Walter got a job as a travelling inspector with the Motor Trades Association. Once again, Winston played a part in securing this for Walter by providing a glowing reference. This read, Inspector W.H. Thompson was detailed for special personal duty with me for 9 years, during which I found him to be capable, reliable, conscientious and trustworthy, and I have much pleasure in recommending him. Winston was obviously not satisfied with this praise, for he added in his own hand, He is altogether an exceptional man, and I should be delighted to give further information if required. It was a job which again took Walter away from home, and his hopes of picking up the tatters of his family life seemed remote. For Kate, his wife, had grown disillusioned by his frequent and lengthy absences from home, and his children were now growing up. Harold, the oldest, was 21, Freddie, 19, Harvey, 17, Grace, 16, and Kathleen, 10. Walter had been a very absent father. When his father emerged from the police force, Harold was unemployed. times was still hard, even 7 years after the Great Depression had begun. Both his brothers had decided to get secure jobs within government service. Freddie was training to be a police officer, and Harvey had joined the Royal Air Force as an apprentice. On the 3rd of March 1936, the government announced a substantial but belated rearmament program. But Winston's hope that he might be recalled as a minister was again dashed. 4 days later, the urgency of rearmament was starkly shown. Hitler sent his troops to reoccupy the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. Once again, Britain and France protested, but did nothing else to stop this flagrant breach of international law. Winston now began to speak and write with ever-increasing urgency about the need to stand up to Hitler and Mussolini and to rebuild Britain's armed strength. By the end of 1936, Winston had firmly established himself as the leader of the pro-rearmament and anti-Nazi forces in the country. But then he rashly weakened his position and made himself even more unpopular with the leaders of his party. He supported his old friend, David, Prince of Wales, in his attempt both to become king, as Edward VIII, and to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson. Public opinion and Prime Minister Baldwin's opposition forced Edward to abdicate on the 10th of December 1936. He went into exile in France, where he married Wallis. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they were now entitled, settled in the south of France, at the Château de la Croix, at Cap d'Antibes. And whenever Winston was on a painting holiday in the area, he would lunch or dine with them. It was a friendship which soon began to seem somewhat dubious, for the Windsors made a widely publicized visit to Nazi Germany, where they met Hitler and expressed considerable support for his regime. Given all these black marks, it was hardly surprising that when Baldwin was replaced by Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister in 1937, he was just as unwilling to give Winston any sort of ministerial post. For Walter, 1937 was another year of change. While traveling for the Motor Trades Association, Walter met a woman named Marjorie Wrigley and decided to go into business with her. They leased 2 grocery stores, one named the Anna Lee Stores in Thornton Heath, which would be run by Marjorie, and the other in Beulah Hill, Norwood, South London, would be managed by Walter. This had the advantage of keeping him near home and provided a job for Harold, running the sub-post office. It also allowed Walter to spend time when he wasn't busy in the shop, writing up his memoirs of his time in the police. There is no record of Winston helping him to find a publisher, but when Guard from the Yard appeared in 1938, Winston was delighted to provide a foreword. In the course of this, he touched wryly on the threats from which Walter had kept him safe. It is astonishing to me, looking back on those times, how many different kinds of people, suffragettes, Sinn Féiners, communists, Egyptians, Indians, and the usual percentage of ordinary lunatics, have from time to time shown a very great want of appreciation of my public work. There were certainly some dangers of which I was not aware until they were past. Winston may have made light of the perils they had been through. What neither he nor Walter could have imagined was that they would pale into insignificance compared with those that were to come. As the war clouds began to gather, Walter, now living permanently in London, regularly kept in touch with Winston.
During the period 1937 to 1939, I often visited Winston at Chartwell. On one occasion, walking with him in the kitchen garden, he talked to me at considerable length. He was very keen to hear from me what the man in the street was saying. "Do they think there'll be a war?" he asked me. I told him that my opinion from what I had heard was the hope of peace. They'd had enough of war. He said, "Thompson, they ignore my warnings. From the knowledge I have from the most reliable sources, I feel sure that unless some substantial move is made, we shall be at war within a year or so."
Winston was right, for early in 1938, Hitler dropped all pretense of reasonableness and embarked on ruthless expansion. On the 12th of March 1938, he annexed Austria, with the apparent support of most of its population and few protests from the international community. Then, during the summer, he demanded that the Sudetenland province of Czechoslovakia, which had a large German minority, must be given immediate autonomy. It was an obvious preliminary to its incorporation into the Third Reich. Fearful that war was imminent, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany on September the 15th to meet Hitler at his mountaintop retreat at Berchtesgaden. He was assured that if Germany could have the Sudetenland, Hitler would make no further territorial demands in Europe. Returning to Britain, Chamberlain persuaded the French to accept this. After a further meeting with Hitler at Bad Godesberg on the Rhine, Chamberlain was told during a debate in the House of Commons on September the 28th that Hitler had agreed to a conference the next day to settle the matter. The Czech government was not invited. He was cheered and congratulated by most members of Parliament. Winston was one of the few who did not, simply wishing the Prime Minister Godspeed. Throughout the crisis, Winston had been in constant touch with the Prime Minister, urging him to stand firm in the support of the Czechs. Chamberlain listened courteously and then totally ignored him. On the 29th of September 1938, Britain, France, Germany and Italy signed an agreement that Hitler could have the Sudetenland in return for a formal declaration that he had no further territorial ambitions. On the 1st of October, German troops entered the Sudetenland without opposition. Chamberlain flew back to London to wave his piece of paper and declare that he had secured peace in our time. He was greeted by the majority of the British people as though he had won a great victory. Winston was in despair. As he said during the Commons debate on the Munich Agreement, Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war. Winston's relations with the government were now as bad as they had ever been. He was also under attack by much of the press and public for his open criticism of Chamberlain, who was regarded as the man who had saved his country from war. But Winston's warnings were absolutely correct. Early in 1939, the Czech president, Emil Hácha, was summoned to Berlin and browbeaten into putting Czechoslovakia under German protection. On the 15th of March 1939, Hitler formally annexed the remaining Czech provinces and made Slovakia a German protectorate. It was shortly after Winston's prophecy about the rape of Czechoslovakia had come true that Walter saw him at Chartwell.
I told him about the uncertainty which existed in the mind of the man in the street over Chamberlain's agreement with Hitler. Many felt it was a farce and that there would be a war. After listening to what I had to say, he spoke. There will be war, Thompson. I cannot see any other way out now. He continued, I have been in constant touch with the Prime Minister, who has listened to me, but I feel that although I have informed him of the unready state of our defences, he will not move in the matter. He means well towards me, but I feel he little realises how poor our defences are. We walked on together. But apart from talking of Chartwell and the work which we had both carried out in making the lakes, he said no more about the possibility of war until I said goodbye. And then he pronounced, "We shall be at war within 6 months."
Winston was more or less precise in his timing. The final plunge into war began on the 23rd of August 1939, with Hitler's greatest coup, a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Ever since the final dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Winston had, as he told Walter, been back in touch with Chamberlain. He constantly emphasized the need for some sort of mutual defense arrangement with the Soviet government. But the Prime Minister showed no sense of urgency. The Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, finally decided that there was a better solution to the German threat. The news of this bombshell coincided with Winston's decision to call short a visit he was on to France. Winston had traveled to Paris on what was intended to be both a business trip and a painting holiday. From there he moved on to Metz to inspect the Maginot Line defenses on France's frontier with Germany. His host was French General Alphonse Georges, one of the many contacts Winston had maintained during his years out of office to keep up to date with military affairs. As he returned to Paris, Winston recorded his concern at how easily the Maginot Line could be outflanked. Winston then moved on to Dreux in Normandy to stay at the strangely named Saint-Georges Motel, which was in fact a chateau of Consuelo Balsan, the ex-Duchess of Marlborough. It was from there that he made the decision which was to change Walter's life forever. Mary Sherburne, the secretary who had gone with him on the trip, describes it. The holiday was supposed to end with a visit to the Duke of Windsor, but that sultry August dragged on and war came closer. I was not really surprised when one morning Mr. Churchill abruptly told me that we were returning to England at once. He was in his bedroom at the chateau when he told me this, and immediately afterwards he turned and looked out of the window and spoke some words that were to have a very important effect on my personal life, though neither of us could have known it. "Send a telegram," he said, "to Sergeant Thompson, asking him to meet me at Croydon Airport the day after tomorrow." The telegram reached Walter while he was working in his shop.
It was terse, like all his urgent commands. "Meet me, Croydon Aerodrome, 4:30 p.m. Wednesday." I thought it a strange order for a grocer.
But Walter did not hesitate. Leaving Harold in charge of the shop, he drove to Croydon the next afternoon.
The plane came in, and as Winston came down the gangway, he saw me and smiled. But I noticed a certain grimness in his face. I waited for some explanation of the summons, but all he said was, "Hello, Thompson. Nice to see you. get the baggage together and bring it to Chartwell. And with that, he was gone. On arriving there, I had a warm feeling inside when he approached me and put one arm over my shoulder, and we walked into the sitting room together.
It was now that Winston mentioned the real reason why he had cut short his trip to France, one of the most serious but little-known threats ever made to his life.
"You are wondering why I sent for you, Thompson," he said. "I have just come from France, as you know, where I was informed on the highest authority that the Germans, believing that I am going to be one of their principal enemies, will attempt to assassinate me."
There is little doubt that Winston's long and loud campaign against the appeasement of Hitler had made him a marked man. Also, Hitler undoubtedly felt socially inferior to Churchill, and as Walter speculated after the failed meeting in Munich in 1932, the snub of Winston's refusal to meet him may well have rankled. It is quite possible in the circumstances to speculate that Hitler had put a price on Winston's head, and that French intelligence had got wind of this plot and sent a warning. Just a month earlier, Count Schwerin von Krosigk, financial secretary of the Third Reich, had been reported as saying that Churchill was the only Englishman that Hitler was afraid of. He went on to comment, "The Fuhrer does not take the Prime Minister or Lord Halifax seriously, but he puts Churchill in the same category as Franklin Roosevelt." Winston now had an implacable enemy, and Walter was well aware that the Nazis would have no scruples in dealing with their most dangerous foe. A warning from the French government had made Winston cancel a visit to the Duke of Windsor's home, as Mary Shearburn reports. This had specific information that an attempt was to be made during this. The Duke and Duchess at the time were still living at the Château de la Croix at Cap d'Antibes, and the villa would have made an ideal site for an assassination attempt. There is no suggestion that the Windsors were in any way involved in any sort of plot, but they had a large staff, and the news that Churchill was to pay a visit could easily have leaked out. The chateau was a considerable distance from any other buildings and surrounded by woods. These separated it from the shore, and any landing from the sea would have gone unobserved. It would also have been easy for an assassination squad to work its way up to the chateau and take up position. It is not clear whether Winston had been invited to stay with the Windsors or whether, as usually happened, he would have gone for lunch or dinner. But whatever had been planned, Winston's life would have been at risk from the moment his car started up the drive from the main road. The area around the main door, with its ornate pillars and steps, was open, and anyone arriving or leaving would have been an easy target for snipers. The sightlines were good, the villa effectively unguarded, and anyone sent in with a high-powered rifle would have had plenty of time to shoot. And then disappear back through the trees to the shore. From there, a speedboat could have got them away almost before the alarm had been raised. Hitler ruled his empire by divide and rule, playing off his henchmen such as Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels against each other. Each man maintained his own intelligence and security apparatus, and there were many men able and ruthless to carry out such an operation. The official military intelligence service was the Abwehr, run by the mysterious Admiral Canaris, but it is not known to have tried to run such clandestine operations. A more likely outfit to carry out such an operation would be the RHSA, or Reichssicherheitsamt, the section of Heinrich Himmler's SS responsible for security and counter-espionage within Hitler's empire. This was commanded by the ruthless and sinister Reinhard Heydrich, whose deputy was an ambitious young lawyer named Walter Schellenberg. Schellenberg it was who arranged the famous operation at Venlo on the Dutch border a few months later, when the two most senior British spy masters in neutral Holland were lured into believing that they were negotiating with generals opposed to Hitler and kidnapped. One of the men used by Schellenberg on this operation was Alfred Naujoks, an officer of the Sicherheitsdienst. He shortly proved his ruthlessness by organizing the Polish attack on the German border radio station at Gleiwitz on the night of August the 31st, 1939, one of the incidents used by Hitler to justify his attack on Poland. Naujoks had arranged for concentration camp inmates to be dressed in Polish uniforms and shot down near the radio station. He was not a man to be squeamish about arranging an assassination, even of a leading figure such as Winston Churchill. Schellenberg and Naujoks would have had no problem finding trained men, for the German army had always attached great importance to the skill of snipers. Any potential Nazi plot in the south of France was foiled by Winston's decision, after the warning from the French authorities, to go straight back to Britain. But his change of plan was, as Mary Sherburne hinted, to have a fundamental effect on both her life and that of Walter, for it brought about her first meeting with her future husband. As Walter describes it, this first encounter did not go too smoothly. After telling him about the proposed assassination plot, Winston continued,
"That is why I've sent for you, Thompson. You go and get your gun, and for the moment, guard me at night. I will guard myself during the day."
Walter told Winston that he was a private citizen, not a police officer, and thus he no longer had a gun. He also warned him that he was likely to be called up as a police reservist at any moment, should an emergency be declared. Winston replied,
"For the moment, Thompson, I will pay you. But I'll be in touch with Scotland Yard on the matter." He then told me to go to his secretary and ask for his .45 Colt automatic. I did so, but found that I did not know the secretary. I told her what I wanted, and immediately she demanded to know who I was. This was a most unusual position for me, as I was used to asking the questions myself. I produced the telegram, but although she had sent it to me from France, she was not prepared to accept it as identification. However, on showing her my driving license, which is an official document, she was satisfied and gave me the automatic. I returned to Winston with the gun, and he said, "You know me well, Thompson. I rarely take notice of threats, but I'm going to take notice of this one because I have something to do."
Walter was left wondering whether Winston was certain that he was about to be made a minister, or whether it was his sense of destiny speaking, his conviction that he had been put on the earth to do great things.
For a few nights I was an unofficial bodyguard, but meanwhile I received notice to report for duty to Scotland Yard. I informed Winston of the call-up notice, and the next day he personally phoned me. "You don't need to bother about reporting, Thompson," he said. "I've spoken to the Commissioner, and you will come to me officially." I was delighted. although I knew what would undoubtedly lie ahead. Long hours, little sleep. However, I felt honoured that he wanted me to serve him again. To guard him was a duty to a friend.
Events now moved swiftly to pull Winston back center stage. Free of the danger of war with the Soviet Union, Hitler turned immediately on Poland. On August the 31st, he summoned the Polish ambassador and complained to him about provocative Polish attacks, all of which had been staged by German special forces. The next day, at dawn, German aircraft attacked targets in Poland, and the German army crossed into it. By chance, Winston had invited General Ironside, the Chief of Staff of the British Army, to Chartwell that morning, and as he arrived at 10 o'clock, was the first to give him the news of the German assault. Ironside immediately hurried back to Whitehall. And later that day, Winston and Walter followed him. During the afternoon, Winston was summoned to see Chamberlain at number 10 Downing Street. There he was offered a seat on the new war cabinet which was being set up. What his role would be was unclear, but at least Winston was back at the centre of affairs. As he returned to sleep at Morpeth Mansions, he must have felt some slight pleasure amid the gloom. Britain and France now at last took a firm line.
It was evident to all of us that war would come. And when the ultimatum to Hitler was sent, Winston said, "He will not withdraw now. It will be war." On September 3rd, 1939, there was tenseness all around us, as Winston, his wife and staff waited for 11 o'clock. There was absolute silence, as though everything had stopped for the Prime Minister's broadcast statement that we were now at war with Germany.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Suddenly, the screech of air raid sirens was heard, and Winston, who was in no hurry to leave for the air raid shelter, looked up at the sky. He eventually decided that we should all go down to the shelter, which was in the basement of an adjoining building. He took a bottle of brandy with him. In the shelter, he moved around like an animal in a cage, and yet was obviously relishing this moment. It was the climax to the years he had spent warning the government. But although I said to him, "Don't you feel like saying, 'I told you so'?" he replied, "No, Thompson. I do not believe in recriminations. Let's get on with the war."
Winston was as good as his word.
Immediately after this, we were on our way to the House of Commons, where the Prime Minister was to make a statement. After this, Winston also spoke briefly. In his speech, he avoided all bitterness and said instead, "In this solemn hour, it is a consolation to recall and dwell upon our repeated efforts for peace. All have been ill-starred, but all have been faithful and sincere."
After this short debate, Walter escorted Winston and Clementine on the brief drive to Downing Street.
Mrs. Churchill waited in the car, And as he emerged from number 10 and entered the car, he said, "It's the Admiralty," and added with apparent relish, "That's a lot better than I thought."
Winston was back in harness, with Walter at his side. The next 5 years were going to be momentous and involve enormous stress and danger. But for Walter, there was no doubt about the bonds which now bound him to the man he must keep safe.
When I first became Mr. Churchill's personal bodyguard in 1921, I'd found his manner brusque, off-handed. I thought then piggish. But I soon began to see through the rough facade, for the grimness to break up in that boyish smile. It did not take me long to like him. In a little while, I came to love him.